What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today we're going to be discussing horizontal versus vertical composition in street photography. And so we'll be looking at some photos, give you some ideas about when to use horizontal versus vertical composition. I don't think it's necessarily a technical decision. I think it's much more an emotional, intuitive decision that you make at the moment when you press the shutter. And recently I've been experimenting way more with vertical composition. And I think I've been pushing myself to do so because for nearly 7 years out of the decade of my practice, I've been shooting strictly horizontal frames. And so now I'm loosening up and I'm starting to see the world differently by orienting myself in relationship to the moments that I'm photographing, depending upon what I deem to be best, horizontal or vertical. And so the importance of orientation is that every frame really does become a decision, where when you see the relationship between the foreground and the background, or the different moments that are occurring simultaneously at a scene, which is what I'm interested in. I'm interested in relating things together in a frame. I'm looking to create the most cohesive way to do this. And so whether or not you shoot horizontal and vertical can enhance the mood, it can change the rhythm or the narrative of a photograph. And so I find that ultimately when I'm making a picture and I'm deciding whether or not I want to shoot horizontal or vertical, it really does come down to the story I'm trying to tell. And so when it comes to the vertical versus horizontal in these two frames that you see on the screen, we have a young boy on the beach in relationship to an older woman. And the older woman is crawling on her knees, getting out of the water, as the boy is looking up into the sun, playfully and joyfully, filled with youth and energy and vitality, expressing himself in the foreground. And so we have this relationship between the boy and the woman. And in order for me to create that relationship, the vertical composition lend itself best. And so I held the camera in a vertical orientation to make that relationship succinct. Whereas if I photographed horizontally, I must have not been able to make this composition, really. I mean, if you look at the scene, I would have been cutting off one or two of the subjects. And so really making the decision intuitively when you're at the scene, when you see the relationships being made, you have to decide very quickly and spontaneously whether or not you're going to shoot horizontal or vertical in order to tell the story. Whereas on the right-hand side, we have these silhouette figures during Shabbat, these Jewish men dancing and parading in the streets. I dropped low using the puddle and the reflection of the water to enhance the dramatic scene that I was capturing. And I decided to photograph horizontally due to the fact that there was a large group of men, there were different layers at play. And so when you're photographing a scene and when you're photographing multiple subjects, a lot of the times the horizontal composition is going to be best. And so when I go out there into the world, I'm not looking at the world myopically anymore. I'm not looking at the world only horizontally. And I think this is really important because it does liberate you and allows you to innovate and experiment more. And so the Ricoh GR, I think, is the best camera for this kind of fluidity because when I'm shooting with the small compact camera, I'm able to adjust the camera in very micro adjustments very quickly and intuitively due to the way in which the small nature of the camera sits on my wrist strap. And the removal of the viewfinder, it really does make this camera the ultimate extension of the hand. When you have the camera on the wrist strap, when you remove the viewfinder, you become one with the camera in a way. And so I'm going to share with you exactly how I hold the camera. Essentially, when I'm shooting, a lot of the times I hold the camera loosely with my thumb underneath, my middle finger, or even my ring finger on the shutter with my index finger on the top. And this allows me to quickly orient the camera from horizontal to vertical in these situations. And so it really does allow this sort of fluidity, this particular camera setup. And so it really is this like sleight of hand gesture that I have been adopting on the streets. And so you can see here my hand holding the Ricoh with my middle finger on the shutter, thumb underneath, index on top. And when I go and orient the camera from horizontal to vertical, it's a very swift and fluid sleight of hand movement that allows me to adjust very quickly on the scene whether or not I want to shoot horizontally or vertically. And so these are just some examples of me actually holding the Ricoh so you can exactly understand how I'm orienting my physical body in relationship to the camera. And it really does become an extension of your body. And so when to go vertical? I think it's important to decide this very quickly. You don't want to be over analyzing in your head. You're going to feel it in your gut whether or not you should shoot horizontally or vertically, right? You don't want to be too much in your head. You want to be down in your gut. And so For instance, on the left-hand side, we have a photograph of an Amish man in a butcher shop. And what I noticed was the taxidermy above him. Initially that's what was drawing me in. And so I necessarily didn't, I didn't look at this scene and like think in my head, is it horizontal or it's vertical, right? Like I'm looking at life, right? I'm looking at the taxidermy, I'm looking at the man, and it's just a very intuitive response for me to go vertical, right? Like it's not like this very like serious like overanalyzing thing. And then again, with the side with the shot on the right hand side, we have this snake that was being raised up, and these people were coming up to pet it in Love Park, Philadelphia. And as the man was allowing people to pet his snake, I realized that if I dropped low, I was able to create a relationship in the foreground with the snake to the background of the City Hall tower. And so it was a very quick and intuitive decision for me to drop low and switch the camera vertically to create the composition. And so vertical is a good option for these sort of like tight separations between the subject and the background, as you can see here in these two frames. And it really does make the viewer enter the frame in a more intimate way. It really does give you this sort of narrow slice of the scene that lends itself well in the vertical composition. And so with these two frames, we have on the left-hand side a vertical frame of a hat in the Chinatown during the Chinatown celebration with the smoke in the background. This was, again, a very intuitive decision. And then on the right-hand side, a car fire. And I find that when you're making these decisions, whether or not to go horizontal or vertical, it really does come down to life as a visual puzzle. And when you look at the life in front of you, you're not trying to overanalyze, but you're trying to make the relationships with that like sort of spontaneity, that sort of like gut instinct to orient yourself or orient your camera. It's not, once again, this like very rational decision. And I really want to emphasize that because I think we can get too caught up when it comes to composition, when it comes to like deciding horizontal versus vertical, and looking at leading lines and the rule of thirds and things like this. It has nothing to do with that. It really is like this gut response at the scene. And so with horizontal compositions, I find that the best situations for horizontal compositions comes down to these sort of like dynamic interactions with multiple subjects. Here we have on Coney Island's beach along the rocks, multiple boys laying out by the rocks, and I got low, separating the subjects from the background, and we have a much more layered dynamic scene. And so with horizontal compositions, you're going to find yourself using this compositional technique mostly with the foreground, middle ground, and background when you want to synthesize them in harmony. And I find that with horizontal frames, they really do thrive in these dynamics when there's lots of things going on, when there's different elements in the frame, and you want to capture these sort of like more broad interactions, when there's multiple subjects in the frame. And I find that horizontal composition is typically the default. I think when you're on the street, you're typically shooting horizontally. However, it's always good to be able to quickly, intuitively respond to the scenes that come your way, whether or not you want to shoot horizontal or vertical. And so, again, two examples here, a vertical versus a horizontal frame. We have on the right-hand side the horizontal frame, where you can see I'm capturing this very broad scene. You can see the skyline of Philadelphia, the snowy path on the boardwalk along the Schuylkill River Trail, with a singular runner going down the path. And this allowed me to capture the broadness of the scene, the vast landscape in relationship to the small figure. And so a horizontal composition lends itself well in this situation because I want to share with you the vast expanse of my city. Whereas on the left-hand side, we have a simple moment in the summer of a fire hydrant with lots of water spewing from it in relationship to the ice cream truck in the background. And so in order for me to make that relationship by isolating the subject in a vertical frame, I was able to create that more intimate and impactful composition due to the simple fact that the moment is happening within that slice of life. And so with horizontal compositions, a lot of the time it comes down to layers, because with layers we can add depth, we can add more dynamics, we can increase the viewer's participation in the frame, where that sort of like dynamic between the foreground, middle ground, and background can give the viewer a pleasing interaction when it comes to looking at your pictures, where the background is a stage. And the Colosseum here in Rome became my stage, where I positioned myself in relationship to that background and this beautiful shadow that was casted upon the wall. And so as people passed through this situation here along the promenade, I was watching as the shadows casted upon the wall. And so I positioned my body in relationship to the Colosseum and the shadows on the wall. And the last thing I had to do was wait for somebody to enter into the foreground to plug in that element within my frame. And then finally we have the relationship between the girl, the shadow, and the Colosseum. And so when you make a composition horizontally, it's going to allow you more play to experiment with layers, to add more dynamics, and to get a little bit more complex and fancy with your pictures. And so with intuition and flow, this is what it comes down to, because a lot of the street photography compositional talk is all about, this like technical jargon, but realistically it's your instinct. It really does come down to that sort of like rhythm of the street that determines whether or not you orient your camera horizontally or vertically. You're going to feel it in your gut, and you're going to have to let your body language guide you when you're on the streets, where your camera does become an extension of your hand and an extension of your eye in a way. And so when you're in the flow and when you're photographing spontaneously and you're allowing the scenes to simply come your way and you see things very quickly, you're going to make these relationships without thinking, right? You see 3 subjects, boom, you go horizontal because you want them all to fit in your frame, right? You want to allow these moments to you want to respond to these moments very intuitively, essentially. Where I was walking down the street here on JFK Boulevard in Philadelphia, and I noticed this man with a blanket on his back. And as he was passing across the street, I made a very quick and intuitive decision to raise the camera up high at a vertical orientation to separate that subject from the background, because the way in which those white lines at the crosswalk related to the white blanket interested me. And so I made that orientation vertical to emphasize that in my frame. And so once again, experimentation is key. And so I find that by opening myself up to vertical compositions has been one way for me to simply experiment generally with my street photography, as it's something very new to me. And so don't get stuck in one orientation, try tilting the camera, but this will come intuitively. You don't have to purposely tilt your camera, right? It's going to happen naturally as you're responding intuitively with spontaneity, and accepting this imperfection is a part of your style. It will become a part of your journey. And I think that these kind of imperfections and these small nuances when you're switching between horizontal and vertical, it really does emphasize that sort of like raw, gritty, candid moment that you're looking to capture. And so, in street photography, I think that every orientation is an opportunity. It really is an intuitive thing. I think that's the moral of the story, and that's a lot of street photography. All of street photography, it really does come down to your instincts, to your intuition, and especially when it comes down to composition. I think that ultimately with composition, it's very simple. Composition is a result of where you position your physical body in relationship to the subject and the background. And when you're looking at life and you find yourself analyzing certain scenes quickly, you're going to make these relationships instinctively. And so don't get too caught up in your head. Just respond with your gut. Here on the left-hand side, I made a very quick decision to make a vertical frame in Rome as I saw these 2 couples here. One in the foreground with the woman and the man, and one in the background with the girl and the boy. And I saw the way in which the light cast upon the surface, and it intrigued me. And because I saw the relationship I can make between the foreground and the background, and the way in which the subjects were positioned upon this stairwell, I decided very quickly to go vertical to isolate that moment in the frame. Whereas on the right-hand side, I saw this man in the window as the sun was setting, and decided that a horizontal composition would lend itself well, as the way in which the text of the window interacted with the man in the shadow was something I needed to add in the frame, whereas a vertical composition would isolate himself a little bit too much. I wanted to have more context in the picture. And so by orienting your camera in different ways, you can create different stories, you can create different dynamics, and you can create more compelling images depending on the scene. And so again, it's not composition, it's not this technical thing. It's a very emotional, instinctive thing. These sort of orientations that you decide to use shouldn't serve you as like a rule. It's mostly a feeling. It's a gut instinct you have. Look at the photo on the right-hand side. We have this boy playing with a toy gun in relationship to this smiling advertisement on the right-hand side. In order for me to include the the two dynamics in the frame, I needed to create a horizontal composition. I had to make my camera oriented horizontally in order to make this relationship, but it's a very intuitive thing. I wouldn't make a horizontal or a vertical frame here. You would only have one of the dynamics. You would only have either the smile or you would only have the gun. But because I have two different things from the foreground to the background that I want to interact with in this particular scene and the way in which they're positioned on the left and right hand side, I needed to create a horizontal frame. And once again, I don't think there are any rules, but at the same time, I believe when you look at a scene, when you look at life, and when you're trying to make a composition, a lot of the times there is a sweet spot. There is the right position that you should position yourself in. There is that sort of right place at the right time. And you can find yourself as you keep going out there and shooting more, discovering where you must position your body in relationship to the moments, whether or not you're horizontal or vertical. But it's a very intuitive act, and you're going to start to recognize these different relationships and how to orient yourself and your camera at these certain situations as time goes on and you make more pictures, essentially. So just keep experimenting, stay fluid, follow your intuition. Ultimately, the goal is to make these relationships as quickly and spontaneously as possible, because with street photography, life is out of our control. A lot of the kind of moments that you're photographing are quick and spontaneous. And so I think that we should match that energy. And that's essentially why I like to photograph very loosely on the streets. I like to hold my camera in a very particular way, as you could see in the slideshow, where I hold the Ricoh with my middle finger or my ring finger on the shutter so that I can quickly orient myself vertically or horizontally. And this allows me to play more, to tinker more, to experiment more, and to always have the opportunity to go from horizontal to vertical. So hopefully some of these ideas helped you today. I just wanted to share this because I haven't really talked about vertical composition on my channel here, on my blog, and I really thought that it would just be a good idea for this morning. Yeah, I'll keep making more slideshows and things when it comes to me. I have a lot of ideas to discuss about street photography. If you want to learn more, you can visit my website at dantesisifo.com. I have 3 different free ebooks. If you click on the books tab, we have first and foremost my contact sheets, where you can learn about the behind the scenes of how I made certain frames. I have the ultimate Ricoh GR street photography guide. And then finally, the mastering layering in street photography guide, where you can learn all about the art of layering. And so thank you for watching today's video, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.